Most people believe they understand how the global economy works. They think its foundations are built on hard work, innovation, natural market forces, and competition. But beneath the surface lies a mystery that challenges everything we assume about progress. What if the true engine of modern economies is not productivity or trade, but something far more fragile and far more powerful? And what if this force has quietly shaped nations, redirected history, and determined winners and losers without most people ever noticing? For generations, economists have reassured the public that global markets are stable systems operating on rational principles. Yet the deeper you look, the more you find a structure built not on balance, but on perpetual borrowing. Debt has become so essential to modern life that removing it would collapse entire economies. To understand how that happened, we must trace a timeline of decisions, slow, subtle, and often hidden, that transformed debt from a simple financial tool into the invisible ruler of nations. Long before modern capitalism emerged, wealth was tied directly to land, resources, and labor. Societies expanded only as fast as they could harvest, mine, or build. Economic cycles were slow and predictable because they were bound to physical constraints. But as trade expanded, something remarkable happened. Lenders realized they could profit not from goods themselves, but from the promise of future goods. This idea would fundamentally transform the world. When early banking families and merchant lenders began issuing credit, they discovered a kind of power no empire had fully controlled before. A loan was not just money exchanged, it was a claim on a borrower's future productivity. It allowed wealth to leap forward in time, but it also created dependency, because once a society grows through borrowing, it must continue borrowing to maintain its momentum. The earliest seeds of the modern debt cycle were being planted. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European empires recognized the strategic value of national debt. Countries could suddenly finance wars, expand militaries, and build infrastructure without waiting for taxes to accumulate. Britain mastered this model early, using long-term government bonds to outspend its rivals. But in doing so, governments became increasingly reliant on creditors. Debt was no longer a temporary emergency measure. It became a permanent component of state power. The creation of central banks cemented this dependency. When the Bank of England was founded in 1694, it marked a turning point. Money creation and debt management shifted to institutions that blended state authority with private influence. Other nations soon copied the model. With central banks controlling currency issuance, governments could borrow endlessly, but only at the cost of surrendering part of their autonomy. Debt had become a system of power, not just a financial practice. The Industrial Revolution accelerated everything. Railroads, factories, and global trade networks required massive upfront investment. Instead of saving for decades, nations and corporations borrowed heavily. Debt was now seen not as a burden, but as a catalyst for progress. But there was a hidden catch. Once economies begin growing through credit expansion, slowing that expansion becomes almost impossible. Debt had become both the engine of growth and the trap behind it. By the early 20th century, the world was deeply entangled in debt. World War I pushed borrowing to unprecedented levels. Countries financed their militaries through massive credit creation, often expecting quick victory to justify the borrowing. But when the war ended, nations faced economic devastation. Germany's hyperinflation, Britain's debt struggles, and global political instability all revealed a painful truth. Debt, mishandled, could shatter societies just as easily as it could build them. The Great Depression demonstrated that lesson even more brutally. As banks failed and trade collapsed, governments tried to reduce debt to restore stability. But cutting spending made economies shrink further, causing even greater hardship. Countries discovered that debt reduction during a downturn was almost impossible without triggering social unrest. The Depression showed that debt was not just a financial issue, it was a structural force capable of reshaping global history. When World War II erupted, nations again relied on massive borrowing. But this time, something different happened afterward. Instead of letting post-war chaos repeat, world leaders gathered in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference to design a new financial order. They created the IMF and World Bank institutions meant to stabilize economies and finance reconstruction. But these institutions also centralized power, linking global finance to rules set by a small group of major nations. Under Bretton Woods, all major currencies were tied to the US dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold. This made the dollar the foundation of global trade. Countries needed dollars to import goods, settle debts, and stabilize their economies. But obtaining those dollars often required borrowing. The United States became the world's primary creditor, allowing it to shape global financial policy in ways no previous empire could match. By the late 1960s, however, the system was cracking. The U.S. had issued far more dollars than it had gold, and foreign governments began quietly demanding gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. The world was losing faith in the system. And in 1971, President Nixon made a dramatic announcement. The U.S. would no longer convert dollars into gold. This decision, made in a brief televised speech, permanently severed money from physical value. Without gold backing, global currencies floated freely. Debt was no longer tied to a finite resource. Governments could print money, central banks could expand credit, and financial institutions could create complex instruments that multiplied debt far beyond traditional lending. The global economy entered a new era, one defined not by the production of goods, but by the creation of credit. During the 1980s, deregulation transformed finance into a high-speed hyperfit industry. Capital flowed across borders instantly. Investors sought huge returns through speculative lending. Developing nations were encouraged to borrow heavily, often for projects that benefited foreign companies more than local populations. When interest rates rose globally, many nations were unable to repay their loans, triggering crisis after crisis. The Latin American debt crisis was one of the most devastating. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina found themselves unable to pay back their foreign debts. Their currencies collapsed, inflation soared, and millions were plunged into poverty. International institutions stepped in with rescue packages, but these came with strict conditions. Privatize industries, cut public spending, open markets to foreign corporations. Debt had become a mechanism for exerting influence and restructuring entire economies. The 1997 Asian financial crisis repeated these patterns. Countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea saw their currencies crash after rapid capital outflows. Once again, global lenders offered rescue loans with policy conditions that reshaped national economies. Each crisis reinforced the same lesson. Debt not only fueled growth, it also created vulnerabilities that external institutions could use to exert control. By the early 2000s, financial markets had grown larger than the real economy itself. Banks created derivatives and mortgage-backed securities that allowed them to expand lending far beyond traditional limits. Borrowers took on debt they couldn't repay. When the U.S. housing bubble burst in 2008, the global financial system nearly collapsed. Millions lost homes and jobs. But major financial institutions received massive bailouts funded by taxpayers. After 2008, central banks around the world injected trillions of dollars into financial markets through quantitative easing. This lifted stock prices, inflated real estate values, and enriched asset owners. But wages stagnated, inequality soared, and national debt reached historic levels. The economy recovered on the surface, but only because debt expanded faster than ever before. By the 2010s, the world was trapped in a new paradox. The economy could not grow without increasing debt, yet increasing debt made the system more fragile. Governments borrowed trillions to fund public services. Corporations borrowed to buy back their own stock. Consumers borrowed for education, housing, and basic necessities. The entire global economy had become dependent on continuous borrowing. The pandemic, in 2020, pushed debt expansion into overdrive. Governments printed and borrowed trillions to prevent economic collapse. Financial markets rallied, even as small businesses failed. Billionaires gained unprecedented wealth, while national debts reached levels once considered unthinkable. The pandemic revealed the full transformation. Debt was no longer a tool, it had become the operating system of the global economy. Today, global debt exceeds $300 trillion, far more than global GDP. Countries now face a future where even small increases in interest rates can trigger economic disaster. Debt shapes foreign policy, trade negotiations, and domestic budgets. Nations that cannot borrow face immediate crises. Nations that borrow too much risk long-term collapse. Debt quietly controls the options of governments and the futures of billions. And this brings us back to the mystery introduced at the beginning. How did debt, something that once represented temporary obligation, become the silent ruler of global economies? The answer lies not in conspiracy, but in a series of policy choices that made debt the center of financial growth, the source of national power, and the leverage used by institutions that shape global behavior. From this story, three powerful takeaways emerge. First, global debt is not a flaw in the system. It is the system, deliberately constructed to drive growth and influence. Second, the world is now dependent on ever-increasing debt, meaning future crises will be larger and more frequent. And third, understanding how debt truly works is essential for anyone who wants to understand the future of global power. If this exploration helped you see the global economy in a new light, consider staying connected with the channel. The more we understand the mechanisms shaping our world, the better prepared we are for the transformations still ahead.